Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today we're going to be talking about karma. This is my second video offering philosophical defenses of the doctrine of karma. The last video was where I explained what we mean by karma in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. By clarifying what we mean by karma, I showed how various objections don't actually apply to this version or this understanding of karma. And now I'm going to be, in this video, responding to victim-blaming objections. The basic form of a victim-blaming objection is that the doctrine of karma is bad because it results in, encourages, or teaches us to blame victims for the predicament they find themselves in. The flip side of this objection is to claim that karma teaches that criminals don't do anything wrong because they are simply delivering people the karma that they had coming to them anyway. It's something like how if there's a judicial system and a criminal is awarded a particular punishment, the executioner or the jailer or the guard, the people who deliver the punishment, they're not doing anything wrong. In responding to these objections, I'm going to be agreeing with the basic sentiments that motivates these objections, which is we should not be blaming victims for the situation they find themselves in, and we should not be thinking of criminals as doing nothing wrong. We should have compassion for victims and help them where we can, and we should shun criminals and think of them as doing something wrong. Where I disagree with those who object to the doctrine of karma in this way is that I don't agree that the doctrine of karma encourages or entails victim-blaming beliefs. A few months ago, I was working on a video on this subject, which I ended up not releasing because I decided to break up the content into a couple of smaller videos. But I think what I spoke there, responding to the victim-blaming objection, was good stuff, so I'm going to reuse it here, partly because I'm very busy and haven't got a video out for a while, so I'm going to do a more low-effort video in order to make it more feasible for me to get more content up. First, I'd like to talk about what the alternative would be, and that is that God is allowing innocent people to suffer something that they don't deserve. On that view, who does and doesn't suffer, who gets cancer, who's born with bad parents or bad genetics, or in a country that has bad political situation or natural disasters, all of that would be determined by chance or whatever a competing worldview wants to say. But if you don't have previous lives and karma earned from those previous lives, then basically you end up saying something that entails the dishing out of bad reactions being capricious. Now, defenders of Abrahamic theologies will want to offer certain solutions to the objection I just laid out. I think I'll have to leave that for another video, but if you want me to address that, please write down in the comments or point me to some resources. Unfortunately, YouTube usually doesn't let you post links, so better if you name a resource. I've got 6 points I want to make in addressing this objection. The first is about conditional compassion versus unconditional compassion. So conditional compassion is where if you think the person is guilty, then you have no compassion for them or limited compassion. But really what we should be cultivating and what Chaitanya Vaishnava theology teaches us to embrace is unconditional compassion, where we feel compassion for people regardless of their guilt. The motivation for this view on our ontology is that all souls, all living entities are pure sparks of the divine, are children of God, the same as us. The fact that they do bad actions is merely due to them being covered over and acting out of ignorance. A helpful and some inspiration for this kind of compassion comes when we realize how dirty our own hearts are and have some introspection about what horrible things we may have done ourselves in previous lifetimes. When we have this kind of perspective, then it becomes far easier to look at everyone else with a feeling of compassion. And of course, with the karmic doctrine, it's pretty theoretical, the idea that some victim who is in front of us now is somehow guilty for their actions. If we look with our objective vision, we can see this is a person who deserves compassion. And when you have a heart which is purified through the process of bhakti, of devotion to God, then it's very sensitive to these kinds of inspirations towards feelings of compassion. Another way of explaining this is by comparing the compassion we feel for someone with a mental illness who does something bad, and explaining how this is similar to people doing bad things without mental illness, but due to ignorance. A real key component to developing this kind of compassion is the idea we find in Gaudiya Vaishnava theology that the soul is always pure. It can be covered over, but underneath all of those coverings is a pure spark of the divine. The next point I want to make adds a key element to what we just talked about, which is karma is for introspecting on our own lives and taking responsibility for seeing the things life throws at us as meant for our own benefit rather than something we are victimized by. Psychologists often talk about how important it is to not fall into a victim mindset, but to take some responsibility for your life. The doctrine of karma is perfect for this kind of psychological benefit when understood properly. But then there's another Vedic concept called dharma. And dharma is important for looking at other people. So when I see someone in front of me, say a starving child, if I think it's their karma to starve, therefore if I feed them, I'm undoing the work of God. That's a complete misunderstanding of karma. The point of karma is to look at my own life and take some responsibility and see a divine hand of providence in my own life, giving me the things I need to learn and grow. But it's not for looking at other people and using it as an excuse to not do my duty. So the word dharma, it doesn't have a perfect English translation, and different English words will be good translations in different contexts. So for what I'm using it for here, the word duty is a good translation. And duty talks about our responsibilities to victims or other people who we come across. So if I see a starving child and I'm in a position to do something to help them, then I have a duty to do so. Now, of course, there's limits to that because we can't possibly feed all the starving children in the world. And there's whole ethical discussions we can get into of what's the right amount of charity to give. And there's Vedic ideas of things we should never be satisfied with. And one thing we should never be satisfied with is how much charity we give. A side point I want to make here is this idea that if you take one idea or one element from another culture and bring it over without bringing other key elements over, you can create a warped system that does more harm than good. The example that made me think of this is Vedic ideas of women. And if you go, I read Jonathan Haidt, who spent time in parts of India studying how they live, and there's very traditional ideas of what women do, but he studied and saw that these women were very happy. So there have been attempts to take traditional Vedic ideas of women to the West, and the women have wound up unhappy. And clearly it's because they've taken some elements and not other elements. So similarly with this idea of karma, if you take one aspect of this Vedic worldview or Gaudiya Vaishnava worldview and leave others out, then sure, you could wind up with a worldview which encourages victim blaming. But if you take the entire worldview, or at least take the key elements, the key principles, and keep them together in the right balance, then you could create good things in the world. Future Arjuna here. I guess I'm treating this video a little bit like an essay where you can go through and edit, whereas video essays, usually if you want to change something, you record the whole thing start to finish which is what I've done in the past. But I'm too busy for that at the moment. So the point I want to add here is that you could think of it as being bad karma to victim blame. So let's use the example of a starving child. If a child is in front of you and hungry and you can do something to help that child, but you don't because you have some deluded idea of, well, if the child's in this situation, it must be their karma to be there. I cannot even fathom the amount of moral depravity a person would have to be in to think that. I have heard mentions of cases of Hindus thinking like that. This is not what the doctrine of karma teaches. But if you're in that situation and that's how you act, you are creating bad karma for yourself by inaction. You can earn bad karma by failing to do something, by failing to act in a charitable way in a particular circumstance. Now, of course, that doesn't mean failing to give charity in all cases is earning you bad karma. Really, charity should be something additional that you're giving from the goodness of your heart. And that's a whole other subject. But there's definitely a point at which your lack of charity is earning you bad karma. And a starving child right in front of you would be one of those situations. I guess the premise here in this idea that, well, the starving child is getting their karma, and if I feed them, I'm taking away the situation they're karmically in, and that will stop them from learning the lesson they need to learn or whatever. The premise here is that God's system is something I could mess up. And if God's system is something I can mess up by feeding a starving child, then God's got issues. And so either we believe God is all-powerful and all-loving, or we don't. But we can't believe God is all-powerful and all-loving and think that me feeding a starving child is somehow messing with God's system and I better let the child go hungry. That's just not a coherent belief system. The flip side to believing that God's system is fragile and I can mess with it is believing something along the lines of everything is in its right place. Now, this is a very liberating belief system, especially for people who are in a helpless situation, people who are victim themselves, thinking there's something in it for me, that there's something in my life and the situations life's throwing at me for my ultimate benefit. And if I look for it, I can find it. That's a very empowering belief to hold. But it's worth noting that belief doesn't conflict with any ideas that there's things I can do to improve the world. Obviously, we are here to do things. We learn and grow as souls by doing things in the world. So the idea that everything is in its right place doesn't mean I shouldn't try to improve the world. It just means I should work within my sphere of influence and not try to be God myself. I should have some faith that I do my bit, other people do their bit, and God has a plan. That's a very liberating belief. And also, karma is gives you great mental fortitude for situations where somebody harms you, somebody wrongs you, or you see some injustice, and there's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, if there's something you can do about it, you do it. But somebody could do something wrong, and there's nothing you can do to punish that person or get back at them or make things right for the victim. But what you can do in all situations is have this underlying faith that there's a system that will make sure people get what they deserve. So it could be me that's the person who delivers this victim what they need to get better. And perhaps you could be in a situation where you can bring justice to a criminal or stop someone for committing a crime. But that's not going to be every case. In most cases, just having this attitude that I have my sphere of influence, that's outside of my sphere of influence, and God has a plan. That is a very liberating and empowering belief system, which, I don't know the research on it, but from what I have heard from psychology and social science, beliefs of this type prevent mental illness and lead to mental fortitude. And now back to past Arjuna. The next point I want to make is that it's complicated. So, while it's impossible for us to know what caused a particular karmic reaction to come down on a particular individual, it's also not always karma. Sometimes Krishna tailors a particular lesson for a particular individual because he wants that individual to learn something specific. And learning those things, unfortunately, sometimes involves suffering. Now, Prabhupada talks a lot about how learning through suffering is what happens when we're too stubborn or too stupid to learn from the more subtle or softer or more pleasant instructions which God is sending our way. Another point I want to make, which I sort of touched on earlier, is that we are all, in some sense, guilty. We're all mixed bags. We've done good things in the past and we've done bad things in the past. And what someone is going through now, I very likely went through in the past or may go through in the future. So to look down my nose at somebody who's currently suffering and think, oh, they must be suffering like that because they did something terrible, is really to miss the point about the grander scheme of things, because we're all just moving up and down in this world, and sometimes we're up and sometimes we're down. And if we just look at that one snapshot in time when I happen to be a little bit higher than someone else and make a judgment, that's a very warped and foolish way to perceive reality. The way the Vedas are calling on us to look at reality is to be broad-minded and see the bigger picture, which is that we've all lived many lives and may be here for many lives more. And in those lives, sometimes we're up and sometimes we're down. And the real goal is to be on our way up and help other people go up too. I think I ended up adding a 7th point from what I had on my list before. So now we'll be on my 4th point, which is a vocab swap. So Prabhupada's doctrine on karma rejects this idea of victim blaming. But a word we can use is accountability. So we're all accountable for our past actions. And the things which happen to us in our lives are cases of us being held accountable for our past actions. Okay, so 2 more points I want to make, which both have to do with a perspective change in how we look at this. The first is about looking at it from the perspective of when we see someone doing bad things in this life, and if we imagine for a moment, say you don't believe in reincarnation, just imagine for a moment that you do. What kind of future birth might you think would be fitting for such a perpetrator to take and beneficial in the sense of helping them to learn compassion and become motivated to reform their character? When we ask that question, then we might imagine someone taking births in the situations which we see some of these victims in. The other perspective change I want to offer is looking at it in terms of the entailments the worldview has on God's character. I mentioned earlier how I think this karmic doctrine has an edge on competing theologies because of the entailments it has for God's character. So a worldview, a theology in which God has people suffering who have done something to warrant them being in that situation, entails God being greater than a worldview which has people suffering for no reason. Now, I know there's various objections that a Christian or Muslim might want to offer to the point I just made. They might want to say, well, even though the particular person who's suffering didn't earn it or deserve it, there's still some benefit that comes. But we can have the benefit that they're offering from whatever they want to put forward, while also have it being the case that the particular spirit soul who's in that situation is one who's there based on things they've done in the past. This view has God being greater than the one where God is assigning capriciously different people to different situations. And in response to this objection, which complains that this doctrine of karma entails the criminal doing no wrong, of course, I reject the idea that a criminal doesn't do anything wrong. Just because a criminal is limited in their ability to perform crimes only against people who have that coming to them as a karmic reaction does not mean that the criminal is not responsible for their actions. We're always responsible for the effects we have on other people when those effects are the result of our choices. An analogy that's useful for understanding this is if we think of a person who has a bounty placed on their head for a large sum of money. If somebody goes and kills that person and collects the money, they might tell themselves a story that I'm not responsible for this person's death because if I hadn't done it, somebody else will. And we can suppose, for the sake of this thought experiment, that it's true the person was going to die anyway at the hands of another bounty killer. But this does not mean that the person is not responsible for the murder. Any court of law will punish the murderer for the crime, regardless of whether the victim was going to die at the hands of another murderer, were it not to be at the hands of this murderer. So similarly, when someone like Stalin or even lesser criminals do bad things in the world, they are still liable for the karmic reactions for what they do, and they are still doing something wrong. We don't have to worry about God's ability to carry out his plan for other people's lives. We just have to worry about doing our dharma, our duty, and being a cause for good in the world. That's all for this video. The next video, I will respond to objections based around identity, which are things like, is it fair to punish people if we're not the same people, or is it fair to punish us if we can't remember? It'd be more fair if we could remember the things we're being punished for, and so on. And I'll also respond to the idea that the doctrine of karma is inconsistent with this idea of grace. I'm guessing the next one will be a much shorter video. So if you like this stuff, be sure to subscribe. Let us know what you think down in the comments. Offer more objections, or let me know if you think any of my arguments fall short in any way. And I'll see you on the next one. Hare Krishna.